The autumn leaves had just begun to fall in the small town of Westfield. The air was crisp, and students from Westfield High were pouring out of the building after the final bell. Among them was 16-year-old Amara Johnson, a bright junior with dreams of becoming a doctor someday. Officer Richard Davis had been with the Westfield Police Department for 12 years. Most people in town knew him as the officer who rarely smiled and often made uncomfortable comments when he thought nobody important was listening. That Wednesday afternoon, he was in a particularly foul mood as he patrolled the streets near the high school in his police cruiser. Amara had spent the afternoon finishing a biology project with her study group. "See you tomorrow," she called to her friends as they split up at the corner of Maple and Elm. The other teens headed toward the bus stop, while Amara continued alone down Elm Street toward her grandmother's house. She adjusted her backpack straps and put on her earbuds, bobbing her head slightly to the music as she walked. Officer Davis noticed Amara walking by herself. Something about seeing this black teenager in this neighborhood seemed to trigger something in him. He slowed his cruiser, following her at a distance. Mrs. Chen, who was watering flowers on her porch, noticed the patrol car creeping along behind the girl. Something didn't feel right, so she kept watching. Amara was completely unaware of the officer's presence. She was thinking about the science test tomorrow and mentally reviewing cell structures. She turned down Oak Avenue, a quiet residential street lined with modest homes and well-kept yards. This was her usual route home, a route she'd walked hundreds of times before. Without warning, Officer Davis suddenly accelerated and swerved his police cruiser onto the sidewalk just ahead of Amara, cutting off her path. The teenager jumped back, startled, pulling her earbuds out. Before she could even process what was happening, Officer Davis had thrown open his door and emerged with his weapon drawn. "Get on the ground now," he shouted, his face twisted with anger. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Amara froze in terror. I'm just walking home from school," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said get on the ground." Officer Davis yelled louder, using harsh language and pointing his gun directly at her. "You people are always up to something." Mr. Wilson, who was raking leaves in his front yard, dropped his rake when he saw what was happening. He pulled out his phone and began recording. Across the street, Mrs. Lee stepped onto her porch, watching in horror as the officer continued berating the frightened teenager. Amara slowly knelt down, then lay face down on the cold sidewalk, her school books spilling from her unzipped backpack. Tears streamed down her face as Officer Davis towered over her, still shouting accusations and slurs. "This is my neighborhood," Amara managed to say through her tears. "My grandmother lives 2 blocks away. Please, I haven't done anything wrong." This only seemed to make Officer Davis angrier. He stepped closer, now standing directly over her. "Shut up. I decide who belongs here and who doesn't," he growled, pressing his gun against her temple. "This is a nice area. We don't need your kind making trouble." By now, several neighbors had gathered at a distance, many recording with their phones. Mr. Wilson had called 911, reporting an officer who seemed dangerously out of control. "She's just a kid walking home from school," Mr. Wilson told the dispatcher, his voice shaking. "The officer has his gun out and he's threatening her. Please send someone quickly before something terrible happens." Little did Officer Davis know that his career was about to end. The next 24 hours would change everything for him, for Amara, and for the entire community of Westfield. Amara lay face down on the cold sidewalk, her body trembling with fear. Time seemed to stand still as Officer Davis continued to stand over her, his gun still pointed at her head. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as more neighbors gathered at a safe distance. "Please," she whispered, "can I call my mom?" Her voice cracked as tears streamed down her face. "Shut up," Officer Davis snapped. "You're not calling anyone until I figure out what you're really doing here." Mrs. Chen, still watching from her porch, had also called 911. "The officer is threatening this poor girl for no reason," she told the dispatcher urgently. "She's just a teenager with a backpack. Please hurry." Mr. Wilson's hand shook as he continued recording. He had lived in this neighborhood for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. "Hey, officer," he finally called out, gathering his courage. "That's just Amara. Her grandmother is Mrs. Johnson from down the street. Everyone knows her." Officer Davis whipped his head around, noticing the gathering crowd for the first time. "Stay back. Police business," he shouted, but the tremor in his voice revealed he was beginning to realize his predicament. Cell phones were pointed at him from all directions. "What's your badge number?" called out Mrs. Lee from across the street. "I'm calling your supervisor right now." Officer Davis' radio crackled to life. "Unit 34, we have multiple calls reporting an incident at your location. What's your status?" Before he could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 more police cruisers rounded the corner, responding to the neighbor's 911 calls. Officer Davis straightened up slightly but kept his weapon trained on Amara. The first car to arrive was driven by Officer Tom Rivera, a veteran officer known for his calm demeanor. He took in the scene instantly: the crying teenager on the ground, the angry officer with his weapon drawn, and the crowd of concerned neighbors with phones recording. His partner, Officer Diane Washington, stepped out of the passenger side, her eyes widening at the scene. "Davis, stand down," Officer Rivera called out firmly as he approached. "Holster your weapon, now." Officer Davis hesitated, then slowly lowered his gun. "This girl was acting suspiciously in the neighborhood," he muttered, but his excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. Officer Washington immediately went to Amara, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, helping the teenager sit up. Amara couldn't speak, just shook her head as she tried to control her sobs. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Officer Washington asked, placing a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder. "Amara Johnson," she managed to say between deep breaths. "My grandmother lives on Oak Avenue. I was just walking home from school." Meanwhile, Officer Rivera had pulled Officer Davis aside. "What were you thinking?" he demanded in a low, intense voice. "Throwing your weapon on a teenager walking home." Officer Davis's face flushed red. She matched the description off. "There is no description," Officer Rivera cut him off. "Dispatch confirmed there are no active calls in this area." The disappointment in his eyes was palpable. By now, more officers had arrived, creating a perimeter around the scene. A small crowd had gathered, many still recording. Mrs. Chen had brought Amara a glass of water, while Mr. Wilson was giving his contact information to another officer. "I'm calling your grandmother right now," Officer Washington told Amara, who was finally catching her breath. "And we're going to need to take your statement about what happened." Officer Davis stood off to the side, his face a mask of anger and growing fear as he watched his fellow officers comfort the girl and gather evidence. Evidence against him. The body cameras on the newly arrived officers captured everything: the crying teenager, the concerned neighbors, and most damning of all, the look of pure hatred that had twisted Officer Davis's face just moments before. As Officer Rivera escorted Officer Davis to a separate patrol car, the gravity of what had just happened began to sink in. "You're going to need to surrender your badge and gun," Officer Rivera said quietly. "The chief is already on his way." For Amara Johnson, the worst 20 minutes of her life were over. But for the Westfield Police Department and the entire community, this was just the beginning. By nightfall, several videos of the incident had spread across social media. The clearest one, shot by Mr. Wilson, had already been viewed over 50,000 times. Local news stations picked up the story for their evening broadcasts, showing carefully edited portions of the footage that captured Officer Davis pointing his gun at Amara as she lay crying on the sidewalk. In the Johnson household, the atmosphere was tense and emotional. Amara sat on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the house. Her mother, Denise, hadn't stopped pacing since they'd returned from giving statements at the police station. "I just can't believe this happened to you," Denise said, her voice breaking as she sat beside her daughter and pulled her close. "Walking home from school, just walking home." Amara's father, Michael, hung up the phone after a long conversation. "That was Attorney Thompson," he told them. "He's coming over first thing tomorrow morning. He says we have a clear case." Amara's phone kept buzzing with notifications, messages from classmates, teachers, and neighbors. Her best friend texted, "Everyone's talking about what happened. We're all behind you. This isn't right." Meanwhile, across town, the Westfield Police Department was in crisis mode. Police Chief Robert Taylor had called an emergency meeting with his command staff. The conference room was thick with tension as they reviewed the footage. "This is indefensible," Chief Taylor said, shutting off the video after watching it for the third time. "Officer Davis violated department policy on at least 6 counts that I can see immediately." Outside the police headquarters, a crowd had begun to gather despite the late hour. What started as a handful of concerned citizens had grown to over 100 people holding hastily made signs reading "Justice for Amara" and "Police Accountability Now." Among them was Mrs. Lee from Oak Avenue. "I couldn't just sit at home after what I saw today," she told a local reporter who was covering the growing protest. "That could have been any of our children." By morning, the story had reached national news. Amara's school, Westfield High, was buzzing with activity as students arrived wearing black armbands in solidarity. The principal, Dr. Howard, called an assembly to address the situation. "What happened to one of our students yesterday is unacceptable," he told the silent auditorium. "This school stands behind Amara Johnson and her family." City Councilwoman Veronica Thompson arrived at her office to find dozens of messages waiting. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing," she told her staff. "We need to call an emergency town meeting tonight." At the local coffee shop, the incident was all anyone could talk about. "I've lived here 30 years, said an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see something like this in our town." By afternoon, the protest outside the police department had grown to several hundred people. Pastor Kevin Brown from the Community Faith Center stood on the steps addressing the crowd. "We don't want empty apologies," he called out, his voice strong and clear. "We want real change. We want accountability. We want our children to feel safe in their own neighborhood." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Back at Westfield High, students were organizing. Amara's classmates had drafted a letter demanding better police training and community oversight. Over 500 students had signed it by lunchtime. "We're planning a walkout for tomorrow," explained Amara's friend Lisa, who had taken charge of the student response. "The whole school is with Amara on this." As evening approached, the Johnson family sat together in their living room, watching the coverage of the protests. Amara looked at the sea of faces, people of all ages and backgrounds, all there because of what had happened to her. "I never knew so many people would care," she said quietly. Her father squeezed her hand. "This isn't just about you anymore, sweetheart. This is about making sure it never happens to anyone else." The morning after the incident, Chief Taylor called a press conference outside the police headquarters. Camera crews from local and national news stations gathered, their equipment humming in the brisk morning air. Tension hung over the crowd like a storm cloud. As of 8:00 a.m. this morning, Officer Richard Davis has been suspended without pay pending a full investigation, Chief Taylor announced, his face grave. "What happened yesterday does not reflect the values or training of this department. We are committed to a thorough and transparent investigation." Inside police headquarters, Internal Affairs Lieutenant Gloria Rodriguez was already hard at work. Her office was small but meticulously organized, and today it was filled with stacks of personnel files. "Bring me everything on Davis," she instructed her assistant. "Every complaint, every evaluation, every note in his file. And I want to talk to every officer he's partnered with in the last 5 years." As she began reviewing the files, a troubling pattern emerged. There had been 6 complaints against Officer Davis in the past 3 years, all from people of color, all dismissed by the previous administration. Lieutenant Rodriguez frowned as she read through them. How had these been overlooked? Meanwhile, Detective William Park was reviewing the evidence collected at the scene. He played the body camera footage for the 3rd time, noting that Officer Davis had manually turned off his camera 4 minutes before the incident with Amara. Fortunately, the camera's automatic audio recording feature had continued to function. "Listen to this," he said to his partner, turning up the volume on a particularly damning segment where Davis could be heard muttering racial slurs before approaching Amara. "This guy was a ticking time bomb," his partner replied, shaking his head. "How did nobody catch this before?" By midday, investigators had obtained a warrant to search Officer Davis's personal phone and computer. What they found painted a disturbing picture. His private social media accounts were filled with racist posts and comments in various online groups. There were text messages to fellow officers with derogatory language about the neighborhoods he patrolled. "Look at these messages from 3 days ago," Lieutenant Rodriguez pointed out during the afternoon briefing. He specifically mentions cleaning up certain neighborhoods and keeping people in their place. Chief Taylor rubbed his temples. Who was he sending these to? "That's what's interesting, sir. Most were sent to non-department numbers, but there are a few exchanges with other officers. We're investigating those connections now." Across town, at the Johnson family's home, Attorney Thompson sat with Amara and her parents reviewing her statement. Amara's voice was stronger today as she recounted the terror of having a gun pressed against her head. "He kept saying I didn't belong there," she explained. "But my grandmother has lived on that street for 20 years. I walk that way every Tuesday and Thursday after study group." Attorney Thompson nodded, taking careful notes. "The department has requested a formal interview with you tomorrow. I'll be there the whole time. You're doing the right thing, Amara." Back at headquarters, Officer Rivera was giving his statement about arriving at the scene. "Davis was completely out of control," he explained. "The girl was already on the ground crying. There was absolutely no threat that would justify drawing his weapon, let alone pointing it at her head." By evening, the investigation had uncovered something even more damning. Tech specialist Tina Winters had recovered deleted text messages from Davis's phone revealing that this wasn't a random incident. Earlier that same day, he had texted a friend complaining about these kids thinking they own the streets after seeing Amara and her friends walking home from school the previous week. This was targeted, Lieutenant Rodriguez realized. He recognized her. He was waiting for an opportunity when she was alone. When this information reached Chief Taylor, he immediately called the district attorney's office. "We have enough to move forward with charges," he said firmly. "This wasn't just poor judgment. This was premeditated harassment based on racial bias. We need to show the community that this behavior won't be tolerated, not by anyone wearing our badge." As day turned to evening, investigators continued working, building a case that would ensure Officer Davis would never wear a badge again, or worse, hurt another innocent person like Amara Johnson. 3 days after the incident, Officer Richard Davis walked into the county courthouse flanked by his attorney, a stone-faced man in an expensive suit. News cameras flashed as they hurried up the steps, Davis keeping his head down while his lawyer tried to shield him from view. Inside, District Attorney Nancy Vasquez stood ready. A veteran prosecutor with 20 years of experience, she had personally taken charge of this case. Her assistant handed her a thick folder as they entered the courtroom. "We're seeking maximum charges," she told reporters gathered in the hallway. "Assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful detention, civil rights violations, and official misconduct. This kind of abuse of power cannot be tolerated in our justice system." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Walter Phillips entered. Amara and her parents sat in the front row alongside Attorney Thompson. Amara wore a simple blue dress, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't wanted to come, but her father had gently explained why it was important for her to be there. "The defendant will rise," announced the court officer. Davis stood, his expression unreadable as the judge looked down at him. The change in his appearance was striking. Gone was the confident officer who had terrorized a teenager. Now he looked small, his police uniform replaced by a plain gray suit. "Your Honor, we request bail be set at a reasonable amount," Davis's attorney began. "My client has strong ties to the community and no prior criminal record." District Attorney Vasquez stood. "The people request bail be set at $250,000. The defendant abused his position of authority to threaten the life of a minor. He represents a danger to the community, particularly to minority residents." Judge Phillips considered this for a moment. Bail is set at $250,000. Additionally, the defendant is to surrender his firearm and have no contact with the victim or witnesses. In the weeks that followed, legal teams on both sides prepared for battle. The police union, which initially stood behind Davis, began to distance itself as evidence mounted. A spokesperson issued a carefully worded statement. "We support due process for all officers, but we cannot condone actions that violate our oath to protect and serve." At the preliminary hearing, Davis's attorney tried a new strategy. Your Honor, my client had reasonable suspicion based on recent burglaries in the area. He was simply doing his job. District Attorney Vasquez was ready. She presented police records showing no burglaries had been reported in that neighborhood for over 6 months. She then showed surveillance footage from nearby homes, revealing that Davis had ignored several other pedestrians that day, only stopping Amara. This wasn't about burglaries, she stated firmly. This was about targeting a young black girl who Officer Davis decided didn't belong in that neighborhood. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered with signs supporting Amara. Local business owners had put up posters in their windows reading, "We stand with Amara and equal justice for all." The Johnson family tried to maintain some normalcy. Amara had returned to school after a week, welcomed back by supportive classmates and teachers. But the trauma lingered. She jumped at loud noises and couldn't walk home alone anymore. "I keep seeing his face," she told her therapist during a session. "I keep feeling that gun against my head." As the case proceeded, more officers came forward with information about Davis's behavior. Officer Rivera provided records of concerns he had raised about Davis's treatment of minorities. Another officer admitted hearing Davis make racially charged comments, but said he hadn't reported them because that's just how Davis talked. The defense team made an unexpected move, reaching out to explore the possibility of a plea deal. District Attorney Vasquez brought the offer to the Johnson family. He would plead guilty to lesser charges, she explained, sitting in their living room. Serve maybe 2 to 3 years. Michael Johnson looked at his daughter. "It's your decision, Amara. We'll support whatever you want to do." Amara was quiet for a long moment. The weight of the decision showed on her young face. Finally, she shook her head. "I want him to face a jury," she said quietly but firmly. "I want everyone to hear what he did. Not just to me, but to others before me. I want things to change." District Attorney Vasquez nodded with respect. "Then we're going to trial." The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. People lined up outside the courthouse before dawn, hoping to get a seat. News vans filled the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, Amara sat between her parents, wearing a simple yellow dress her grandmother had made for the occasion. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited for the proceedings to begin. Her father noticed and gently placed his hand over hers. "You can do this," he whispered. "Just tell the truth." The door opened, and Officer Davis was led in. He wore a navy suit that seemed too big for him now, his face gaunt from the stress of the past weeks. His eyes briefly met Amara's before quickly looking away. Judge Phillips called the court to order, and the trial began with opening statements. District Attorney Vasquez approached the jury box, her steps measured and confident. "This case is about abuse of power in its most raw form," she began. "You will hear evidence that Officer Richard Davis, sworn to protect and serve, instead chose to terrorize a 16-year-old girl walking home from school. You will hear how he targeted her because of the color of her skin, how he pointed his service weapon at her head, and how he threatened her life, all while she was simply walking through her own neighborhood." Defense Attorney Clark countered by painting Davis as a dedicated officer who had made a mistake in judgment. "Police work requires split-second decisions," he argued. "My client believed he was protecting the community. Was he wrong? Perhaps, but that doesn't make him a criminal." Over the next several days, witnesses took the stand one by one. Mr. Wilson described how he'd watched the entire incident unfold from his yard. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," he testified. "She was just a kid with a backpack." There was no reason for him to draw his weapon. Mrs. Chen testified about hearing Officer Davis's racist remarks. "I was watering my flowers when I heard him say things I cannot repeat in this courtroom," she said firmly. "No child should ever hear such words, especially from someone meant to protect them." The most powerful testimony came from Officer Rivera, who had been first on the scene after the incident. "In my 15 years on the force, I've never seen such an abuse of authority," he stated. "There was no threat, no danger, just an officer who lost control." Digital evidence proved equally damning. The tech specialist showed the jury Davis's text messages and social media posts. The audio from his body camera, though missing video, clearly captured his threats and slurs. The courtroom fell silent as Amara's terrified pleas played through the speakers. When it was Amara's turn to testify, she walked to the witness stand with her head held high. Though her voice sometimes faltered, she recounted every detail of that afternoon: how she'd been thinking about her science test, how confused she'd felt when the police car suddenly blocked her path, and the terror of having a gun pressed against her head. "I thought I was going to die," she said simply. "I kept thinking about my mom and dad and how they wouldn't know what happened to me." During cross-examination, defense attorney Clark tried to suggest Amara had been acting suspiciously or had somehow provoked the encounter. "Did you run when you saw the police car?" he asked. "No, sir," Amara replied calmly. "I had no reason to run. I was just walking home from school like I always do." "And you didn't make any threatening movements?" District Attorney Vasquez objected immediately. "Your Honor, the defense is badgering a minor victim." Judge Phillips sustained the objection, giving defense attorney Clark a stern look. As the trial continued, expert witnesses testified that nothing in Amara's behavior warranted suspicion, much less the level of force used. A police training expert explained how Officer Davis had violated multiple protocols. Even if he had legitimate concerns, which the evidence suggests he did not, drawing a weapon on an unarmed teenager would be an extreme overreaction, the expert testified. Former colleagues reluctantly took the stand, describing instances where Davis had made racially insensitive comments. One officer admitted there had been an unspoken culture of looking the other way. On the final day of testimony, Officer Davis himself took the stand. His attorney had advised against it, but Davis insisted. He claimed he had feared for his safety, that he had received reports of gang activity in the area. District Attorney Vasquez's cross-examination was methodical and devastating. She showed him his own text messages, his social media posts, the department records showing no such gang reports. "Officer Davis," she said finally, "isn't it true that the only reason you stopped Amara Johnson that day was because she was black?" The courtroom fell silent. Davis struggled to maintain his composure. "No comment," he finally said. After 6 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 6 hours before reaching their verdict: guilty on all counts. 2 weeks after the verdict, Amara and her family returned to the courthouse for the sentencing hearing. The room was quieter this time, with a sense of solemnity hanging in the air. Officer Davis sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Judge Phillips looked down from the bench, his face serious as he prepared to deliver the sentence. He had reviewed hundreds of letters from community members, most urging a harsh punishment to send a message that such abuse of power would not be tolerated. "Before I announce my decision," the judge said, "does the victim wish to make a statement?" Amara hadn't planned to speak. She had thought her testimony during the trial would be enough. But that morning, something had changed in her. She nodded and walked slowly to the podium. "My name is Amara Johnson," she began, her voice soft but steady. "6 months ago, I was just a regular high school student with normal teenage worries. I worried about tests and friends and what college I might attend someday." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Now I have different worries. I worry about walking alone. I worry when I see a police car. I have nightmares that wake me up at night." She looked directly at Officer Davis for the first time since the trial began. "I want you to know that what you did changed my life forever. But I refuse to let it ruin my life. I'm not just a victim. I'm a survivor. And I hope that someday no one will have to go through what I went through." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as she returned to her seat. Her father wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his face filled with pride. Judge Phillips cleared his throat before speaking. "Richard Davis, you were entrusted with a badge and a weapon to protect all citizens equally. Instead, you used that power to terrorize a child because of the color of her skin. This court sentences you to 8 years in state prison." Officer Davis was led away in handcuffs, no longer an officer but a convicted criminal. In the months that followed, healing began, both for Amara and for the community. The Johnson family filed a civil lawsuit against the police department, which was settled for $1.2 million. Rather than keeping the money for themselves, the Johnsons used most of it to establish the Amara Johnson Foundation for Justice, aimed at supporting young victims of racial profiling and police misconduct. "We want something good to come from this terrible experience," Michael Johnson explained at the foundation's launch event. This isn't just about money, it's about changing the system. The Westfield Police Department underwent a major overhaul. Chief Taylor, determined to prevent similar incidents, implemented new training programs focused on bias awareness. He'd established a civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. What happened to Amara Johnson was a failure on multiple levels, Chief Taylor acknowledged during a town hall meeting. We're committed to earning back the community's trust, one day at a time. New officers were required to complete expanded cultural sensitivity training, and existing officers attended monthly workshops led by community members from diverse backgrounds. Body cameras became mandatory, with strict penalties for turning them off during interactions with the public. For Amara, the journey toward healing was slow but steady. She started a support group at her school for students who had experienced trauma. With her therapist's help, she gradually overcame her fear of walking alone and began to trust again. In the spring, she was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. Standing at the podium in front of hundreds of law enforcement officials and community activists, she no longer felt like the frightened girl from that terrible day. "My story isn't unique," she told the audience. "What makes it different is that there was justice in my case. Too many others never get that chance." Her speech received a standing ovation, and afterward, a group of police cadets approached her to shake her hand. "We're training to be different," one young cadet told her. "Your story is part of our curriculum now. We want to be part of the solution." On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Amara visited her grandmother's neighborhood. The residents had planted a small garden on the spot where Officer Davis had threatened her, with a simple plaque that read, "From darkness comes light. From injustice comes change." As she placed flowers by the plaque, Mrs. Chen came out to greet her. "You changed things around here," the older woman said, hugging Amara. "You showed everyone what courage looks like." Amara smiled, looking around at the peaceful street where her nightmare had begun. The memory would always be there, but it no longer held the same power over her. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her fear into strength, proving that even in the darkest moments, justice and healing were possible.